Hello all, welcome to the video series SQL. In this video, we will talk about constraints. So let's get started. So what is a constraint? It is a set of rules. A set of rules that are imposed on a column is called constraint. So basically when we are trying to design a table and then the columns, so we can have some conditions on the column saying that only this type of data can flow into this particular column. Alright, so you can basically try to give some conditions for each column saying that only certain type of data or only this format of data can come into this particular column. Okay, so why do we want to do that? Let's take an example of an application. Let's say I'm trying to create an application where I want to store customer's first name, customer's last name and customer's age. Now the customer came in and then he tried to enter his age as 400 or 250. Okay, so which is not an accurate value, because if you store that value which doesn't make any sense, your table will basically have some inaccurate data. It's not reliable data. If someone looks at the table, they can't believe that data is accurate. Alright, so for that reason you put some conditions. Okay, the customer can enter his age only between 18 and 99. Okay, so that's how you put some conditions on your columns, and then by putting that conditions, the data that is coming into the table will be controlled or will be of good quality. Okay, so that is a constraint. So basically a constraint is a set of rules that you impose on a column to maintain the data quality. Alright, so what are the uses of constraint? So by putting a constraint, basically you are trying to control the data that is coming into the table. You are maintaining the quality of the data that is coming into the table. So your data is having more quality by putting constraints, and then your data is more reliable, and then your data is more accurate. Okay, so basically you are trying to ignore inaccurate data coming into your table. Okay, so that's the use of constraint. So when you are trying to design a table, you need to make sure that if you can put some constraints to maintain the data quality. Okay, so there are different types of constraints that we can create on a table. So null or not null constraint, primary key constraint, foreign key constraint, and then there are other types of constraints that we will talk about in our next video. But then in this video we will concentrate on these three types of constraints. So we will see what is a null or a not null constraint. So null, what is the meaning of null? Null means unknown information. The information is not known, or the information is not provided by the customer. Okay, so null means it's just nothing. You cannot compare the null value to anything. Okay, so null is always an unknown value. An unknown value can be 1, an unknown value can be 1000, it can be 1 million, or it can be anything. Okay, so you cannot say an unknown value is equal to something else. Okay, an unknown is also, you cannot compare an unknown value with another unknown value. Alright, so basically null is an unknown value, or the information is not known. So how do you create these constraints when you create a table? So let's quickly create a table. Create table customers and then customer ID integer and then customer ID. When you are trying to create a customer ID for a customer, you cannot have a customer without a customer ID. All right, or let's take this way. If you are trying to create a bank account table, and then if you are trying to give a bank account number to each customer, can you give an unknown bank account number to a person or a customer? No, right? Every person should have a bank account number. No customer cannot have, any customer cannot have be a customer of the bank without any bank account number. Alright, so that's why when you're trying to create a customer ID column, you have to say not null. That means you are not allowing a null value into this particular column. And then let's say first name, varchar. So can there be any customer without a first name? No. So you provide a not null. And then middle name. So some customers, some people may have middle name and some people may not have middle name. So in that case you provide null, saying that null values are allowed in that particular column. And last name. Similarly, every customer should have their last name. So basically that's how you design your table. And then if you create the table, and then if we are trying to insert some data into this table, and then let's say if we are trying to insert a customer ID and then first name and middle name, and then we are trying to ignore the last name. Customer ID is 101 and then first name is John and middle name is B, and then we are trying to ignore last name. So if I try to run that query, it basically fails, saying that null is not allowed into last name because a null value cannot be entered into a last name. Last name has to have some value in it. Okay, so I'll try to give that column as well, last name. And then that query runs successfully. Now if I try to ignore middle name instead of last name, I'll try to ignore middle name and then try to run the query. It takes it. Okay, and then if I look at the data in the table, so this is the first record we inserted with first name, middle name and last name and customer ID. Okay, and then when we are trying to insert another record with a middle name as null value, that means we didn't give any middle name, so SQL Server automatically took it as a null value. That means information is not known, and then it didn't fail because middle name was designed such a way that nulls are allowed into that particular column. Okay, so that's the difference between a null constraint and a not null constraint. Now let's talk about a primary key constraint. What is a primary key constraint? A primary key constraint maintains uniqueness in a column. A primary key constraint maintains uniqueness in a column. So in this table, when we try to put the data, we created two records. Alright, and then we are saying, okay, John Baggett has a customer ID 101, and then John, another customer, John is having same customer ID. Okay, so a customer with first name John, middle name B and Baggett has customer ID 101, and another customer, a different customer with first name as John and last name as Baggett has the same customer ID as the other person, which is not true, which cannot be true, because if you are trying to get a bank account number in a bank, you cannot have same bank account number sharing with the other person. So two customers in a bank cannot have the same account number. Alright, so that's why you create a primary key on a table to maintain the uniqueness. Okay, so now let's say when we are trying to create this table again, and then here when I'm trying to create the customer ID column, I would say primary key column, primary key constraint. Okay, meaning no duplicates are allowed into this column. Okay, so if I try to drop that table again and then create it, now if I try to insert the first record, it inserted successfully, and then you can see John B. Baggett has been given a customer ID 1, and then if we are trying to insert another person, you can just put it as another person as well. Okay, and then if you are trying to give the same customer ID, it will give you an error saying violation of primary key constraint, cannot insert duplicate key in table this, and then the duplicate value is 101, meaning 101 is already assigned to another customer. You give any other number other than 101. Okay, so you cannot basically have two customers having the same customer ID. So now if you try to put in as 102 and then execute it, now it's successful, and then if you run the select query, you can see the second person is given a different customer ID. Okay, and then let's see if when we are trying to design this table, can we say null value. Okay, and then if you try to create the table, it says cannot define primary key constraint on a nullable column. That means you cannot have a customer without a customer ID. Like you cannot have a customer, you cannot have a customer without a bank account number. Okay, so you say there are 100 customers, each customer should have their own bank account number. Bank account number cannot be unknown for any customer. Alright, so for that reason you cannot have null values in a primary key column. Alright, and then when you create the table, and then even if you are trying to not provide any customer ID, it will give you an error saying null is not allowed. Okay, so because null cannot be allowed in this particular column, every customer should have a customer ID. Alright, so that's how you create a primary key column on a table. And then the most important thing is every table should have a primary key. Okay, if there is no primary key, you cannot identify the record uniquely. Okay, so for that reason you need to have a primary key on each column. That primary key will tell you okay, this customer belongs to this, information belongs to this customer, and this information belongs to this customer. Alright, so let me show you an example. So if we try to create this particular table without a customer ID, okay, and then I entered customers, okay, so two customers came in to this table, and then two customers are saying that they have their first name as John, middle name as B, and last name as Baggett. It can happen. Two customers can have their same first name, same middle name, same last name, right? So I tried to insert the data, and then I designed this table this way. Now if I look at the table, John, middle name and last name. All right, so now how can I say which customer this this information belongs to which customer and this information belongs to which customer, right? I cannot say it. So I need to have a customer ID column which will tell me that okay, this information belongs to the customer 101, this information belongs to customer 102. All right, so that table was poorly designed without a primary key column. Okay, so if I try to create the table now, and then if I have to enter customer ID, and that's the first customer, and then that's the second customer, and then if I look at the data, you can see okay, even though the two customers are sharing the same first, middle and last names, but their customer ID is different. So using that particular primary key column, you can tell what information belongs to what customer. Okay, so that's why you have to have a primary key in each table. Okay, so that will help you identify each record uniquely. That means this record is unique because its customer ID is 102. This customer is having 101 as customer ID. Okay, so that's how the primary key helps you to identify the record uniquely. Okay, and then you cannot have duplicate values in primary key column, and you cannot have null values in a primary key column. Okay, so the properties of primary key columns are values are always unique and no null values are allowed. Okay, so basically that's the primary key column, and then you have to remember that the primary key is a mandatory, or it's a good practice to have a primary key column on each table. Okay, and then now we were trying to create a primary key column or primary key constraint on one column. Can we have a primary key column, a primary key constraint on more than one column? Yes, we can. Let's say we are trying to create a table to store states. Okay, so I'll try to create a table called country and states. Let's say the country name, and then varchar 100, and state name varchar 100. Okay, so now I told you that I have to create a, it's a good practice to have a primary key on each table. Okay, so now I want to create these two columns. Okay, so now I want to create a primary key column on this particular table. Okay, so now let's say if I create a primary key column here. Okay, so when you're trying to insert some data into the table, okay, I'll just remove that and then I'll show you how to insert the data into this table. So I'm trying to insert the data into this table, and then the values I'm providing are USA and let's say Texas, and then let's say there is another country, Russia, and then let's say there is a Texas state as well in Russia. Okay, so now if I try to insert this data, try to create this table, and then I try to insert the data into this table. Now if I look at if I look at the data in this table, USA Texas and Russia Texas. Okay, so on which column, if I have to create a primary key on this table, how do I create a primary key? Can I create a primary key column on country name column? Okay, let's try to do that. Okay, if I try to create a primary key column on this one, but I can insert a new record saying USA and state as Florida. Alright, because I'm trying to insert basically all combination of states and country. Okay, so if I try to insert this data, and then if I try to create a primary key column on country name, it will try to fail because you are trying to insert two records with the same country name. Okay, and then primary key does not allow duplicate values. Alright, so that's the reason primary key is not a good thing to be created on country name column. So let's say I try to create a primary key here on state name. Okay, but you still cannot create it here as well because Texas is in USA and Texas is in Russia. Okay, but can I use the combination of these two columns to create a primary key? Because you cannot have a combination as duplicate. Okay, because in USA you have Texas, in Russia you have Texas, but then in USA you cannot have another Texas, or in Russia you cannot have another Texas. Alright, so you cannot have duplicates by looking at the combination. The combination of these values cannot be duplicate. That means in one country you cannot have more than one Texas. Okay, so that's why here in this scenario, if you have to create, you can create a constraint on combination of columns. And then if you create that table, Alright, so now you can enter this particular information, and then if you look at this, see Russia, Texas, USA, Florida, and USA, Texas. You cannot have another USA, Texas. If you are trying to insert, let's say I'll try to remove this and then I'll try to insert Florida again, it says the violation of the primary key, and then the duplicate is the combination of USA and Florida, because USA and Florida is already there in that particular table. Okay, so now the primary key is created on 2 columns, so the combination shouldn't be duplicate. Alright, so that's how you can create a primary key on 1 column or more than 1 column. So foreign key columns, foreign key constraint. So what is a foreign key constraint? Foreign key constraint basically ties the relationship between the first table and then the second table, or you can also call the parent table and the child table. Okay, so what is a foreign key constraint? So let's look at it. So in our customer table, we have a customer John, and then we have a customer Robert. Okay, so if I look at so there are 2 customers. Okay, now I try to create another table called address table. Okay, and then in this table I'm trying to create address ID integer, not null, and then I would say primary key. Okay, because every table needs to have a primary key, so I created address ID as a primary key column, and then I would say customer ID integer, not null, and address as address line 1, then varchar 200, not null, and city okay. So that's how I try to design the table. Okay, so now if I try to insert some data into this table, address, and then let's say address ID as 11,000, and then for the first customer, so I have, how many customers do I have in my customers table? 102 and 105, two customers. So 102, and then the address line 1 as Texas and Texas. Okay, and then I'll try to insert a second address, 105, okay, and then I'll try to enter a third okay. So basically I'm trying to enter 3 addresses. Okay, and first customer has address in Texas, and then the second customer has basically 2 address. Okay, so if I try to run that query, it takes it happily, and if I look at the data in this customers and look at the data in the address table, you can say, okay, there are 2 customers. Okay, and then this customer 102 has address as Texas, and then 105 has 2 address. One address is in Florida and the another address is in Michigan. Okay, all looks good. But then let's say if I try to insert another address, 107 and 1103, and then I would say New York, okay, it takes it happily, and then if I look at the data, you can see the customer 102, John's address is Texas, and then Robert's address is Florida, and Robert has another address called Michigan. But what about 107? There is an address in your address table for which there is no customer. 107 is not your customer at all. Okay, so that means you are trying to store some invalid data. Okay, so you cannot have an address where there is no customer. I mean, you don't have a customer but you have address. What do you do with that address? All right, so for that reason you need to use a foreign key constraint. You can create a foreign key constraint on customer ID table in customer ID column in address table, saying that the customer ID should be existing if I have to create an address for that customer. So the first the customer ID should be existing in the customer table. Only for that customer I can create a address in the address table. That basically we are trying to create that constraint to make sure that the address comes in only after the customer is there. Alright, we don't want to store an address without a customer. Alright, so for that we have to create a foreign key constraint. So I would create this table properly by saying, okay, foreign key references customer table customer ID column. Okay, so what does that means is I'm trying to create a foreign key constraint. Okay, and then what does foreign key constraint is basically nothing but there is some value in the parent table. The parent table is your customer table. Okay, so the parent table is your customers table. So whatever the customer IDs is there in the customer ID column in the parent table, only those values can come into this customer ID column in the address table. Okay, so foreign key references customer ID table and customer ID column. So whatever the values are there in the customer ID column, only those values can come into this customer ID column address table. Okay, so that's how you tie these two tables, customer table and address table. Okay, so now if I try to drop this table and recreate it, and then if I try to insert these statements again into the address table, so the first three addresses went good, and then if I look at the data, you can see the addresses are belonging to the customers which are there in the customers table 102 and 105. But if we try to insert an address for a customer who is not your customer, alright, so if I try to insert that address, it says insert statement conflicted with the foreign key. This conflict occurred in database table customers and column customer ID. That means it's saying that there is a foreign key constraint error. That means you are trying to insert the address for a customer. That customer is not existing in your customer table. Alright, so that's how you maintain the foreign key. That's how you maintain the foreign primary and foreign key relationship between two tables. Okay, so that's how the two tables are tied. Okay, so if you look at the two tables, you can say, okay, this is 102 is my customer ID, and then this is his information, and then for 102 you go look in the address table, and then that's his address. Okay, and then 105 is your customer, and then for 105 you have two addresses in address table. Okay, so these two columns, this is the primary key in customer table, and that customer ID is a foreign key in your foreign table. Or you can also call this table, customer table, as parent table and the address table as child table. Okay, so that's how you create a foreign key and a primary key constraint. And sometimes you can also create a constraint, you can also create a design a table saying that address ID and customer ID, address line and city. Okay, and in the customer ID column, instead of putting not null, you can just say null value. And then if you try to create this table, and then if you try to insert the first three address, and then when you are trying to insert a third address or an extra address, you can say null value. And then if you try to insert if you look at the table, you can see there is an address, but then the customer information is unknown. Okay, this makes much more meaningful than when we put 107. If you say 107, if someone looks at it and then says, okay, there is no 107 customer, how can the address come in? Okay, but then if you try to insert an address without any customer information, then without any customer ID, then maybe you can think, okay, this address doesn't belong to anyone. Okay, but then putting a wrong customer ID without the customer is completely wrong. Okay, this is at least acceptable. In some cases, in some scenarios, you have to have, when you are trying to do some inserts, if the information is not already existing in the parent table, you can just put it as a null value. Okay, if you don't want to allow that address also, then you can design your table by saying not null. Okay, and that way you can maintain your data perfectly accurate. All right, so now we were trying to create a primary key constraint and foreign key constraint when we are trying to design the table. Okay, so now let's say in the address table, I didn't create the primary key in the first place. Okay, I just designed the table as create table address. Okay, I just designed the table without any primary key constraint. So how do I do that after the table is created? So now the table is created. Now for the primary key, to create a primary key constraint, I don't have to drop the table every time. Okay, so what I can do is I can use a alter table name and then add constraint, and then you can give the constraint name as well, pk underscore address underscore on that column. So basically that's your constraint name, like you have a table name, column name, right? So that's your constraint name. And then what type of constraint it is, primary key, and then on what column, address ID. So basically instead of typing primary key here, once the table is ready and after 1 month you thought that, okay, I didn't create the primary key, and then you came back and want to create the primary key, you can do it by using an alter command. Okay, so alter table and then the table name, add constraint name, and then the type of constraint and on which column you want to create a constraint. So if you run that, you can see the constraint has been created on this particular table. Okay, so similarly you can add a foreign key constraint as well. Okay, so add alter table name, add constraint, and then let's say foreign key, and then on address, and then customer ID column, and you can say foreign key references customers table customer ID Okay, so basically you are trying to create a foreign key constraint on customer ID column in address table, which references to customers table customer ID column. Okay, so that's how you do add table name, add constraint, foreign key constraint name, and foreign key on which column you are adding, customer ID column, and which is referencing to customers table customer ID column. Okay, so if you try to run that query, you can see the foreign key has been added, and where you look at these foreign key constraints and primary key constraints will be located on your table properties. If you look at the tables and then look at the address table, and then you can click columns, you can see that gold key that represents the primary key, and you can also see pk, that means the primary key has been created on this column, and fk meaning foreign key has been created on this column. Okay, and then here also you can see the constraint names pk underscore address, or these are the names that we have given to these constraints. Okay, so basically that's how you can create a primary key and foreign key constraints. And then if you have to drop the constraints, you can drop it, alter table name and drop constraint, and then let's say I want to drop this foreign key constraint. Okay, so alter table name and then drop constraint name. All right, similarly you can drop other constraint as well. Okay, so that's how you work with the constraints. And then there are some interview questions here which we already discussed in our video, so you can look at it.